Question. Who is Wonder Woman's arch nemesis? Easy question, right? I mean, for any other hero, it would be very easy. Superman? It's Lex Luthor. Batman? Joker. Fantastic Four? Doctor Doom. And for others, it's a range of different characters. Spider-Man, it's either Green Goblin, Doc Ock, or Venom. But unless you're a hardcore Wonder Woman fan, you might pause when having to answer who Wonder Woman's main adversary is. I'm sure many of you are saying, oh, her main enemy is the Cheetah lady, or Ares, the god of war, or something. A couple of you might say genocide, in which case, you've read some Gail Simone, clearly. And yeah, you'd be correct. But the fact you had to think about it is proof that Wonder Woman kind of has a villain problem. That's not to say that the Cheetah isn't a fascinating character, because she is. That's also not to say that Wonder Woman doesn't have any good stories with interesting adversaries. She does. But I think the problem ultimately is that it's strange how Wonder Woman, despite having such a richly developed world, so many years of stories, decades even, her stories tend to fall back on either a furry with an ever-shifting backstory, or some figure from Greek mythology, or Wonder Woman, but wicked. You know, some variation of, it's Wonder Woman's corpse, reanimated. It's another Amazonian, but instead of being a demigod with Zeus, it's a demigod with Darkseid. And as a result, Wonder Woman doesn't really have the adversary. Unlike, say, Thor and Loki, Wonder Woman doesn't really have her Loki. She has the Cheetah and Ares and Circe, but that's not the same. When you notice this, you realize that there's a certain pattern established between Wonder Woman's various villains. That's not to say that they don't have anything interesting to say, but that the writers don't always use them in a way that's interesting. And some writers just cast them aside, recycle other characters, abandon others, bring others down to a level where they're not as interesting or important. You get all these writers who don't use Wonder Woman's rogues gallery in an interesting or dynamic way. And why is that? I think before we discuss why Wonder Woman's villains struggle to be interesting, I gotta first establish what makes a good villain. Great supervillains exist as foils to their heroes. Batman is a serious figure of order and restraint. The Joker is chaotic, uncontrolled, sadistic. They're similar in that they're both men dominated by an inner darkness, but how they respond to that darkness and how they react to those drawn to them illustrates their differences. They're opposites, and that opposition to each other's moral code makes them interesting. Many of Spider-Man's villains are given great power, much like Spider-Man, but unlike Peter Parker, deal with them without responsibility, or they're victims of those who exercise great power irresponsibly. Another thing that most villains tend to be centered on is some idea or theme that runs counter to the main hero. There has to be a degree of unity that connects the characters and unifies them. Those outside of that unifying factor tend to be outliers who are either more interesting by the differences of the rest of the characters or just underwhelming. X-Men villains are considered connected by the relationship between mutants and humanity. They exist in this conversation. Should mutants be accepted by mankind? Should mutants fight mankind? What is the position and role that they share? But the outliers, like Arcade or Mojo, feel all the stranger because they exist outside of that core dynamic. But that's another element too. Nuance, complexity. Magneto and Doom are great villains because they are at once sympathetic and tragic and understandable to an extent. You get why they do what they do, and maybe even sympathize with what they do and how they do it. But there is that X factor, the element of this character that makes them so distinct. Maybe it's charisma, maybe it's charm, maybe it's their grandiose plans, over-the-top statements. Likewise, Lex Luthor. You get why Lex Luthor is the way he is. You understand his motivations, his pride, his arrogance, his one-man war against Superman. But Lex Luthor's war against Superman is almost admirable in how futile it ultimately is. He's a man challenging a god. Even though you're rooting against him, it's kind of impressive that a man with such small physicality is fighting someone with so much power.
Well, it's interesting. Most of the iconic superheroes have a character who is their opposite thematically in some way. I didn't really see that for Wonder Woman. She didn't seem to have a lot of characters who came at her with that approach. I think the closest is probably Ares. Wonder Woman is about peace, love, and compassion, and protecting those things, even if it means sacrificing her safety and serenity. So Ares, being the god of war, is probably the closest thing to her opposite. But I've never found Ares to be scary, really. He can be interesting and manipulative, but he's got that DC Gods thing where he's a bit removed and aloof, and that takes away some of his impact as a direct foe. He's best as a guy pushing the chess pieces around.
I don't think many of Wonder Woman's villains have that, and part of that is due to underexposure. No one outside of the hardcore comics fans cared about Loki until the MCU, and likewise, no one's going to care about the Cheetah until she has her Loki moment. So, why hasn't she? For starters, I think a lot of Wonder Woman's villain problems can be traced back to the core problem with Wonder Woman comics in general. People can't pin down how to write her correctly.
One of the biggest problems with Wonder Woman is every new writer comes in with what they think is a hot take. The take that's going to get her massive acceptance. And sometimes, in our arrogance, we don't address what came before. Some writers don't even read the stories that came before when they take over the book. So every 3 years or so, it's a new Diana. The characters don't carry over. So it's almost impossible to create new villains for her because it's a guarantee the next writers won't use any of what you've built. It's frustrating, and it gets under my skin to this day.
Wonder Woman was originally written as an extension of William Moulton Marston's philosophies about gender and sexual liberation, but every few years, Diana would be reinvented by new writers with different ideas. There was a period where DC tried to make her a super spy and stripped away her incredible powers, more James Bond than Greek goddess. There were points where she was just the Justice League secretary. Even Diana's origins as an Amazonian, born on an island of just women, that was changed in the New 52, where she became a demigod, born of Zeus and Hippolyta. If you can't even get her origin consistent, how can anyone expect to get her rogues gallery consistent? If you disagree that Wonder Woman's world keeps shifting from writer to writer, then I ask you this. What is Etta Candy's personality? Hell, what does Etta Candy even look like? The answer seems to change every couple of years. Imagine if Mary Jane Watson's whole role and physicality and personality and everything shifted this much every 5 years or so. She would not be an established character. Consistency is important for a character to become memorable, and Wonder Woman's characters aren't very consistent. Hell, let me ask you this. What's Donna Troy's backstory? The problem is, if the characters aren't written consistently, they can't be established to an audience. Now, in my opinion, Wonder Woman really came into her own with the George Perez run after Crisis on Infinite Earths. That run codified the best of what came before and established a roadmap for what should come in the future. But even then, that codification didn't really make Wonder Woman perfect. They were still rough runs of Wonder Woman after that point. Just compare the controversial Jodie Picoult run of Wonder Woman to the Gail Simone run. The two runs that happened in close proximity to one another that completely reinterpreted the character and her world. Now, I recommend the Gail Simone run and the Greg Rucka run on Wonder Woman. They're both more aligned with what I'd like to see the character consistently be, and feel more in line with the George Perez world that he created. Also, I know it's a YA novel, but I also really like Leigh Bardugo's Wonder Woman novel, which totally reinvented the character in something that felt more in line with her work on the Grishaverse novels like Six of Crows. Also, read Six of Crows. At this point, I'm not asking you, I'm telling you. How can someone establish a consistent lore with consistent villains, with so many changes from year to year? This isn't like a Batman who has remained a rich billionaire in Gotham City for his entire run. These are substantial upheavals, both in motivation, in terms of power, in terms of personality, in terms of appearance, in terms of everything. And even Wonder Woman is going through these stages of upheaval. It's ridiculous. The other problem too, I think, is that Wonder Woman is so tied in with Greek myth that some writers just go, well, obviously her bad guy is going to be some figure from Greek mythology. Circe and Ares slotted easily in. But most of the other various monsters of the Greek world, they kind of fill the role of the one-off villain. I think some of Wonder Woman's more interesting villains are the types like the Circle, a small gang of Themyscirans who resent the birth of Diana. An extension to the mythology is far more interesting than simply being a recreation of classic mythology, taking the established lore of the Greeks and doing something new with it. Also, characters like Genocide, who are just the body of Wonder Woman brought back in time and reanimated. It's crazy and over the top, but it works in a silly way. But then there are the wackier villains, like Dr. Psycho and Giganta. Dr. Psycho has been popular thanks to the Harley Quinn show, where other sillier villains have gotten a second life in sorts, but Dr. Psycho's psychic powers aren't distinctly Wonder Woman-esque, though he does feel like a natural in this weird rogues gallery. Giganta, I think, fits more with Wonder Woman, being like basically a pastiche of the Attack of the 50-Foot Woman. Only thing with Giganta is she flip-flops morally. She has points where she's more sympathetic and points where she's more a threat. And that humanity, I think, really works with Giganta. And she's a fun villain to look at. I mean, look at her. She's a big, giant woman. That's kind of fun. But it's also not distinctly Wonder Woman-esque, especially considering it's a reference, again, to Attack of the 50-Foot Woman. It's an established sci-fi trope, just applied to Wonder Woman. They feel like general DC villains that you might have forgotten about. When other writers try to introduce new villains, like Tom King's Sovereign or Gail Simone's The Circle, they often appear in a very limited capacity, and while these stories might be compelling, they often feel self-contained, one-off. To use another comparison, Spider-Man Sin Eater appears in one of the most compelling stories of his history, The Death of Jean DeWolf, but the story itself is not known for its villain, it's known for its mystery, for its compelling drama, the human story. Likewise, Hush's debut story, Hush, is fantastic, but Hush is the weakest point of Hush. He's the weak link. And likewise, The Circle and the Sovereign, and the Sovereign is also known by some as the King of the United States of America, they exist as thematic adversaries to Wonder Woman, yes, but they feel like threats that don't come back. They fade away into obscurity after the initial fight. Once the page closes on their book, no one is compelled to bring them back. And I feel like that's a common thread with a lot of Wonder Woman's villains. Once she beats them, who cares if they come back? But again, there is one exception to all of this. The Cheetah. There are multiple cheetahs, but my personal favorite is Dr. Barbara Minerva, a rich British archaeologist who raids an African tribe for treasure only to be transformed into a cheetah deity after a ritual, or at least that's her original origin in the George Perez run. Different interpretations have changed how sympathetic Minerva is prior to her transformation as well as after. Perez made her a selfish, vain woman who arrogantly thought she was owed the world's treasures. Also, part of why she transforms initially is because the ritual she undergoes is supposed to be done to virgins only, and Barbara isn't one, which opens the door up to all sorts of uncomfortable implications there about the sanctity of women and their values in society after, well, you get the idea. I'm not going to harp on that one right now. I also like how in the DC Rebirth relaunch, Barbara is one of Diana's friends. She's part of the core team of characters and forms a close relationship with Etta Candy. Some might say very close. I also enjoy with that version of Barbara how it's uncertain if the cheetah is going to be on Diana's side or not. She flips back and forth. Both women care for each other, but they're often forced apart by circumstances or personal pain to fight. And that's interesting. There's a tragedy there that makes them very compelling. It's a good dynamic, and I feel like other adaptations should note this, but they don't. Instead, they make Cheetah the boring action lady in a cheetah suit, but we'll get to that later. She's not tied in with Greek myth directly, but she feels at least tied to Wonder Woman thematically. Or at least she would, if her origins were consistent over the decades. Or her identity. I personally prefer the angle that she's an archaeologist who has been cursed by her findings, tying her somewhat to the Wonder Woman's mythology, while also allowing her to be a distinct character all her own. Original DC. I like it when they're friends, torn apart by circumstances, because I like that idea of people who are close maybe being negatively affected by each other and going in different directions. I like it when friends are turned enemies in stories. And she's immortal, fighting a goddess, a demigoddess essentially. It's a curse outside the Greek pantheon, implying there's other gods out there that Wonder Woman must contend with. There's just elements to it that are so interesting. But there is a problem. It took years for this version of Cheetah to come around. The first Cheetah was Priscilla Rich, who mainly just dressed like a cheetah. What were her powers? She didn't have any powers. She kind of felt like a weird knockoff of Catwoman, a woman who also didn't transform into a cat. Priscilla didn't have any transformations at all. She just dressed up like a cheetah in a leopard cheetah skin outfit. Like, how is someone dressed like a cheetah with no powers going to compete with a literal goddess? Minerva didn't appear until the George Perez run in 1987, meaning the cheetah's current identity was established shortly before Venom first appeared in Marvel Comics, and more bizarrely, her entire power set, motivation, nature, personality, everything was built from the ground up in the mid-'80s, after decades of this character being established as this kind of nothing figure. This new version didn't immediately overshadow the decades of generic history where the Cheetah felt like kinda sorta Catwoman. Now, to an extent, this isn't terrible. The post-crisis era reimagined several villains. Lex Luthor went from being a mad scientist to a corrupt businessman. And this shifted a few things about his character, but the core of Lex Luthor still remained. He was still an egotistical, brilliant man. He had strategic approaches to fighting Superman as opposed to just raw force. And he had vast resources used to build technology. None of those changed. We just changed how he got the technology, how he got the resources. This is unlike the Cheetah, who went from a cat-themed antagonist to a literal cat creature cursed by the gods themselves. And this upheaval really forced us to reevaluate what the character was like, especially considering, again, they've been established for decades previously. And all of that wiped under the rug. Even Mr. Freeze, when he was reinterpreted by the DC animated universe, the core of his character, that he's a guy with a freeze gun, didn't change. But what I think really keeps the Wonder Woman villains from ascending to that next level is how infrequently they're adapted and how disappointing these adaptations tend to be. A good adaptation of the character can reinvent how audiences see them. Remember, no one cared about Mr. Freeze until the 90s show. That established his origins, his motivations, his powers, his lore to a new generation, and quickly put him in the limelight as one of Batman's greatest villains. Now, Wonder Woman has appeared in multiple cartoons and films, but often she exists as part of the Justice League, as a member, not as an individual. There have been no solo Wonder Woman animated shows. The few animated movies where Wonder Woman appears, she's again either part of the Justice League team, or she's fighting figures from Greek mythology and Greek myth. Come to films, you have a set of villains, but very few of them feel distinct. In the first Wonder Woman film, Wonder Woman fights in World War I, with Ares posing as this abstract threat until the frankly disappointing third act. By having Ares feel so abstract, the film manages to create this point about humanity and war and the way we conduct ourselves. But Ares as a character isn't all that compelling of a final boss. He's more interesting before the fight. If Ares stopped just as this Mephistopheles-esque figure who tempts man and drives them to act a certain way, that would be more compelling, I think, than the big CG brawl we get at the end. It's fun to watch things get thrown around and punched, but you can have that same finale without the big fight. It makes Ares feel more down to earth. It makes Ares feel more like a threat you can just pound hard. And I think it's kind of underwhelming that Wonder Woman just kills a god, you know? Like, first fight, kills a god, well, okay, now nothing can stand up to her. She's too powerful. Only Darkseid or something like that could really stand a chance against her. By having her beat a threat that powerful, that quickly, with that little prep time, it dilutes all future threats that Diana will face, and also removes the abstract nature of the gods here. What could have been a very compelling adaptation becomes more memorable as a disappointing finale of an otherwise great film. Come Wonder Woman 1984, we get two main villains, and both are disappointing. Maxwell Lord is not a Wonder Woman villain. The most famous encounter is when Wonder Woman killed him in the lead up to Infinite Crisis, yes, but Maxwell Lord could have been any guy. It doesn't have to be him in this story. There's nothing distinctly Maxwell Lordish in the version of Maxwell Lord we see. It could have just as easily been Lex Luthor, and nothing would have changed. We just get a guy who wants wishes granted and becomes a manifestation of granting wishes. That's not even distinctly Maxwell Lord. There's nothing about this guy that feels original to the character. And granted, I think Pedro Pascal's really good in the role. He's entertaining. We got a good meme or two out of him. But he's just not a very compelling villain because, quite frankly, there's nothing distinct about this character, much less as an adaptation of Maxwell Lord himself. But then there's the Cheetah, who I think almost works. Almost. See, they set up the Cheetah as basically Syndrome, or Batman Forever's Riddler, or The Amazing Spider-Man 2's Electro. She's this dorky, socially awkward character, an outcast, who develops an admiration for our hero. And she's given an opportunity to become powerful. And she chooses to use that power irresponsibly. And this arc culminates in the only actual fight in the entire movie between Diana and Cheetah, a build-up that we've been waiting for decades, and it leaves next to no impression on its audience. For one, you can barely see what's happening. The fight is very poorly lit. For another, the fight itself kind of feels forced. It doesn't tie in with the core conflict with Maxwell Lord. It doesn't resolve any conflict, really. And the fight ends without any of the real ideas or themes of the Cheetah's arc being resolved. And also, the Cheetah... Look, I'm not saying you need to go full furry, but she doesn't look animalistic at all. She looks like someone trying to do a stage production of the show Cats, which granted is better than 2019's Cats, but, I digress. It's still not compelling. It doesn't look like the Cheetah. It doesn't look distinct enough or memorable enough. As a result of all this, the Cheetah feels somewhat forgettable in her own work, even though she has a personal connection with Wonder Woman. She interacts with her throughout the entire movie, representing the themes of being given a wish, of having a chance to change your world, even at the cost of others, even at the cost of something personal to you. The selfish desire to have what you want versus the safety of the world. But the problem is 1984 really squanders this opportunity to establish the Cheetah as Wonder Woman's nemesis, especially considering the Cheetah is only the Cheetah for a single fight scene. It feels like a missed opportunity. She feels tertiary in an already overly long film, and made all the worse because that fight that Cheetah gets into doesn't actually resolve any of the themes of the movie. She feels like an extension. You could remove her, and the movie would still have the same finale. What's excessively disappointing about all this is that this might be the biggest role the Cheetah has gotten up until this point. In all the adaptations that include the Cheetah of the Justice League cartoons and various animated films, the only one where I felt the Cheetah was presented as a real threat is that one Catwoman anime film where Catwoman and Batwoman fought her. That threat existed only due to a power difference, not because of any thematic difference between the Catwoman and the Cheetah. The Cheetah often exists in adaptations as just a part of an established villain team-up, someone for Wonder Woman to punch really hard. Most adaptations rarely establish who the Cheetah is, how she became the Cheetah, what she's about, what motivates her. She's just an extension of whatever main villain hired her. She's barely even a foil to Diana. She's just a vague villain that the girls have to fight. And as a result, she feels underwhelming. Audiences do not know why the Cheetah is what she is. She's just a glorified henchman. And yeah, she's cool looking, but that's about it. And I think that's the thing too. Every major villain has that story, the one that defines them as a real threat. Black Manta killed Aquaman's son. Green Goblin killed Gwen Stacy. Joker, well, take a pick with the Joker. He has a whole graveyard filled with his victims. But the Cheetah, what's her big story? What's the one where she cut Wonder Woman too deeply for her to ever get over it? Well, there is none. For Ares in the DCEU, the Zack Snyder era, Ares kills all the gods, sure. But why do we, the audience, care? We don't know the gods. They're dead by the time we start the movie. They're the old gods, they're in the past. Diana doesn't know the gods. She's not emotionally connected to Zeus, her father. We don't even know it's her father until Ares tells us. Even the death of Steve Trevor doesn't feel like something Ares is directly responsible for, based on how Ares exists in the narrative. Therefore, Ares doesn't have that big circumstance. And Circe, well, Circe is now more associated with creature commandos in the average person's mind outside the comics, thanks to her first appearance being the Creature Commandos animated series. And even then, Circe was overshadowed by how G.I. Robot had a really delightful, fun day. That's the more memorable part of that episode.
Are these Nazis, General?
Dr. Psycho, yeah, he's part of Harley Quinn's entourage, and more memorable as a result. You don't really associate that version of Dr. Psycho with Wonder Woman, it's more with Harley Quinn. And Ares, the only character I think most audiences will associate with Wonder Woman thanks to the very successful movie, well, he's known for being a disappointing final act. Every scene with Ares is regarded as disappointing because that final fight feels so out of place. That's your first impression. You could have been a Loki, but instead you're just Doomsday Part 2, essentially. So what can be done? I think the comics have done some good work with Wonder Woman villains, especially the Cheetah. The problem is the emotional depths of the comics have not translated to the big screen, or even the little screen. I think what would really help is, say, a Wonder Woman game. Something where you can make Ares or the other monsters in these big arena fights, or have Wonder Woman fight the Cheetah with build-up and this epic kind of fight. In the same way that the Insomniac Spider-Man games really introduced a ton of people to folks like Mr. Negative, or turned established villains like Kraven the Hunter or Doc Ock into villains you love to hate, that build up gradually until you confront them. And even, you feel a bit of sympathy for them. Or the same way the Batman Arkham games have reinvented Batman and his cast to so many new viewers and gamers. A good game can reintroduce so much goodwill into these characters and their stories. At least, that's what I would say. If they didn't cancel that Wonder Woman game and close the studio that was making it, indicating that no, DC isn't going to do that with Wonder Woman at all. Great! Love that. Fantastic. Could have had the Arkham Asylum version of Wonder Woman, instead we got not a goddamn thing. As for James Gunn's new DCU, there appears to be no plans in active development to bring Wonder Woman to the screen. So there's no chance for the Cheetah or Cersei to get their redemption as villains the same way that, say, Ocean Master and Black Manta did with general audiences in the Aquaman movies. Well, actually, that's not entirely true. Cersei did appear in Creature Commandos, but again, minus Wonder Woman. Despite multiple cartoons being in active development, Wonder Woman isn't getting any of those either, so audiences won't get a chance to know her various villains that way. There is a series that was announced, but there's no momentum on this project. We don't know if it's moving forward or what, so the future of Wonder Woman is very, very unclear. So how the hell are audiences supposed to get Wonder Woman when DC isn't giving Wonder Woman or her villains any single chance to really emerge outside their specific bubble? And even then, when they do emerge, they don't have the room they need to feel like real established characters. So what's DC gonna do? If you asked me what I would do, it's very simple. Start with a run like Spider-Man's The Gauntlet. The Gauntlet was a storyline following One More Day that was designed to reinvent the classic Spider-Man villains for a new generation. While the stories were hit or miss, it was a great way to remind audiences why these classic villains still were relevant, what roles they had in Spider-Man's life, what threats they posed the webhead, and most importantly, why they were so compelling. The moment in the Gauntlet that comes to mind especially is the story Shed, where the Lizard, Kurt Connors, sheds his human side by devouring his family, cutting the one tie he had to humanity before he could completely become a lizard. The Cheetah should have a shed moment, where her animalistic nature takes over and Wonder Woman is forced to either help her friend or stop her from doing something to completely cast off the identity of Minerva in a cruel, painful fashion, one that is both destructive and self-destructive. We've gotten close to this in Rebirth, but I think going all in might really push the relationship Diana and Minerva have to a new level. Further, if you make a Wonder Woman movie, which you should, because why wouldn't you, the first villain should be either Cersei or the Cheetah. Ares is a good broader scale villain, but let's reestablish someone Wonder Woman can have a personal connection to, rather than starting her off with a god. Let the Cheetah, Wonder Woman's main adversary, have an actual role in the story from start to finish as the Cheetah. Let her be a threat, the main threat. Let her be Diana's foil in the plot, a force of avarice and desire. Let her be the Loki in the series, where she reoccurs again and again in new contexts, sometimes as a reluctant ally to Diana, sometimes as an adversary or threat, but never abandoning her wants in the process. She should be a figure of tragedy and greed, a figure of destruction and mercy, a figure who Diana doesn't know what to do with, but also wants to help in some way, perhaps even her greatest failure coming back to remind her that she failed continually to help Minerva overcome her own inner demons. And whatever threat they face outside of the Cheetah rivalry, it should be an opportunity for them to maybe reconnect, maybe draw close, maybe give Diana a chance to help heal Minerva's inner darkness, only for things, either within their control or outside their control, to completely ruin it. Reminding Diana that even though she has all this power, all this skill, she can still fail. Also, add in random weirdos for Wonder Woman to fight, right? Put in Giganta, put in Dr. Psycho. I would love to see Diana fight a giant big woman who's expressing her inner turmoil in a physically destructive manner. I would love to see that hallucinations and all of that, all of Wonder Woman's strength and powers being used against illusions and hallucinations, much like with Mysterio or Scarecrow. But let's also bring in a Minotaur, Medusa. Bring in genocide even. Have her clobber a monster and then fight the big bad who's like some schemer or something like that, like a Circe. And as for the gods, they should be immeasurable. They should be much stronger than Wonder Woman. They should feel like universal forces that even Diana can't stop. But importantly, these villains should be opportunities for Diana to show her true strength, and that's empathy. These villains can be harsh, cruel, but Diana should always try to see the good in them, to reach them on an emotional level, to show kindness in response to cruelty. She shouldn't be relenting. She shouldn't be she shouldn't be overly merciful and overly sympathetic, but she should always reach out and try to empathize with her opponents before fighting them. Combat should be a rational but deliberate choice when all else fails. Even 1984 gets this right with Maxwell Lord, where the problem is resolved with Diana reaching out emotionally to Maxwell Lord. The problem is the film doesn't do that well, but that idea should carry through with future films. But also, ultimately speaking, it shouldn't always work. Sometimes you have to fight. Sometimes you have to confront your opponents. Overall, Wonder Woman's Rogues Gallery are interesting. They are some great threats. They are some great stories involving them. But the problem is general audiences are kept at an arm's length from her stories, even in adaptations. And when different writers come on board with Wonder Woman, they keep trying to reinvent the wheel, which means that none of these characters gain the traction they need to become established in the eyes of comic audiences as well. The problem is there's very little hope for Wonder Woman to become more dynamic. It's been decades, and we've gotten only a couple adaptations of her that mean anything, that have broken outside the comic audience and into mainstream notoriety. A TV show from the 70s and 2 movies, and only one of those movies are discussed actively. And also, DC, between you and I, really important, Etta Candy, can we just establish who she is? Like, stop changing her every couple of years. Give us, like, an actual character. Like, someone who we know, who's static. It shouldn't be this hard to get a couple of core things about Wonder Woman's life ironed down.